Welcome to Friend or Foe, the series where I analyze characters from our favorite games and figure out if they would be good to hang out with, or whether you might want to avoid them at the next party. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and in this episode, we're putting ourselves in the shoes of one of the most controversial characters in Telltale games, The Walking Dead, Lilly. As always, I've created a playlist for this series, so you can easily keep up with it and watch every episode available anytime. I'll link that in the description down below. Prior to the start of the zombie outbreak, Lilly was an administrative officer at the Robins Air Force Base in Warner Robins, Georgia. As things started going bad, she teamed up with her father, Larry, also a military veteran, and the first time we meet her is in the Everett Drug Store in Macon, Georgia, as she's scolding Carly and Glenn for saving a group of survivors consisting of Lee, Clementine, Kenny, Katjaa, and Duck from a horde of zombies in the street outside the pharmacy. She's understandably upset that they would draw so much attention to the store, and she's worried about her dad as he suffers an arrhythmia due to the stress of the new group and zombies outside trying to get in. As the new members of the group settle in, her main focus is on getting behind the counter where the medicine is stored, with the hope that there will be some nitroglycerin pills for her dad. He was on a regular prescription prior to the start of things, and as the dead have started walking, she realizes it might be a while before they're able to get that prescription refilled. She spends most of her time by her father's side, as Lee and the others work to figure out a plan to not only get the medicine, but also get them out of the pharmacy and to someplace safe. She normally likes to take charge in these kind of situations, but she's finding it hard to concentrate as her dad is all she has left in the world, and she can't even imagine losing him under the circumstances. He wasn't the best, and he definitely made mistakes, like letting the power to the house get cut when she was a kid to prove a point about the cost of electricity. But he loved her and had always made sure that she was taken care of. After a while, Lee is able to acquire the keys to the pharmacy area, and she goes with him as he opens the door, ready to grab whatever she can and help out. But the alarm for the secured area is apparently still functional, and while they are able to get the medicine, it isn't long before zombies are crowding the building. Kenny is able to bring his pickup truck around to the back door of the building, and soon the group is making their way out of town, stopping at a motel on the outskirts to catch their breath and figure out the next move. Her first thought is that the military is bound to roll through sooner or later, bringing relief and a cure for the virus. And she, Lee, and Kenny decide to try to make the motel into a temporary base for the group. But that expectation would be shattered over the next few months, as things just continued to get worse. They were able to secure the motel for the most part, and even wound up taking in a man named Mark, who had holed up at the start of things in a commissary storage closet at the Air Force Base. He had a decent amount of food to offer in exchange for joining the group, but that food didn't last as long as everyone had hoped, and after a few months they all found themselves on the brink of starvation. To make matters worse, Lee, Mark, and Kenny returned to the motel one fall day, carrying a wounded man with another young man close behind. They'd apparently come across a trio of people while out hunting, with the man having stepped in a bear trap, and Lee had decided to cut the man's leg off and bring him back. The whole situation was a mess, and now they would need to use some of their dwindling medical supplies and maybe even low food supply on a couple of complete strangers, putting the whole camp at risk. Larry tried to stand up for her, something he'd been doing a lot, and while she was glad to have his support, she would have preferred that he stay out of things. She was trying to lead the group, usually having to fight with Kenny for that role, and her dad coming to her rescue at every turn only undermined her. Calming things down, she turned to Lee as a possible ally, asking him to hand out the day's rations. It was a chore that she usually took upon herself, but she was starting to realize that the food shortage might not be as obvious to everyone else as it was to her because of this, and she was hoping that Lee, having to make the decisions about who got food and who didn't, would help him understand the stress that she was under. She wasn't surprised to see Lee feed Duck and Clementine, as she could tell he was the type of person to prioritize the kids, But she was also a bit surprised to see him give food to Larry after how the old man had been treating him. Her dad didn't like Lee, but he wouldn't be specific about the details. He'd told her that Lee had killed someone before the outbreak, but he didn't seem to think that he was a threat to them now, and he was willing to let him stay in the group. Lee had only just finished handing out the day's rations when things took a horrible turn as the man they'd brought back turned into a zombie and nearly killed Katjaa. At first, everyone thought that he must have been bit, and that Ben, the kid he'd been with, had failed to mention it. But that was quickly dismissed when Ben revealed to the group that the bite wasn't actually what caused a person to turn. He told them that he'd seen several people that he knew that hadn't been bit turn, and he assumed that everyone was infected and would turn no matter what, assuming their head hadn't been destroyed. As shocking as the news was, though, it took a back seat when a pair of men came out of the woods across the street from the motel, ultimately offering to trade food for gas. The whole thing seemed too good to be true, but they couldn't really afford to turn down an offer like that given their situation. And Lee, Mark, Ben, and Carly went with the pair of brothers to scope out the place as Lilly and everyone else waited back at the motor inn. Before long, Carly and Ben returned, reporting that the place was real and offering to stay and watch the motel as everyone else went to get a meal. But it wasn't as perfect as it seemed. As Lilly and the rest approached the farm, they noticed that Lee and Mark were talking to the brothers, with Mark holding something on his shoulder. It turned out they'd been shot by some bandits while exploring the farm's perimeter, and Mark now had an arrow in his shoulder. The family matron, Brenda, offered to fix him up, and though she seemed super friendly, Lilly wasn't entirely sure the farm was as safe as it seemed. Even so, she was willing to give it a shot, if only to get a hot meal for the group, and especially for her dad, as he hadn't been doing very well. But things couldn't be too easy, and Lilly soon found herself arguing with Kenny once again. This time because he felt the need to go poking around the farm, risking the group's chance for a hot meal in the process. She couldn't understand why he wouldn't just leave well enough alone. The St. John's had welcomed them onto the farm, offered food like they hadn't had in months, and Kenny was willing to throw it all down the drain because he wanted to snoop. Thankfully, Lee offered to talk to Kenny, and the whole thing seemed to have blown over by the time everyone was sitting down to eat. The food was delicious, but Lilly only had time to take a few bites before Lee came rushing into the room, yelling at everyone to stop eating. She wasn't sure that she believed him at first when he told them that the meat on their plates was Mark, but Brenda confirmed it, and in a matter of moments all hell had broken loose as Lee was knocked out by one of the brothers, and everyone else, except for Katjaa and Duck, had been rounded up and forced into the meat storage locker in the back of the barn. Lilly was feeling sick to her stomach, realizing that she'd been eating Mark's legs, and she couldn't even focus on anything close to a plan to get out of the locker as her dad banged on the door and Kenny frantically searched for a way back to his family. She couldn't believe that they'd fallen for the ruse, and that Kenny had been right all along. But things were about to get worse. Larry had been yelling and pounding on the door for a few minutes, and that stress wound up bringing him another arrhythmia. But this one seemed worse as he collapsed on the ground and stopped moving completely. Rushing to his side, Lilly tried to find any sign of life, scared of the potential truth that her dad, the one person she cared about in life more than any other, might actually be dead. She could hear Kenny jumping to that conclusion, and she didn't like where he was going with his tone. Begging Lee for help, hoping that he might see something she missed, she was thankful when he joined her at Larry's side and started CPR. But then the world came to a crashing halt, as a block of salt came flying in out of nowhere and crushed her father's head. Kenny had taken matters into his own hands and killed Larry. It wasn't possible. He was the man who would never die, never leave her alone. He'd been far from perfect, but he didn't deserve what Kenny had done. Rage, sorrow, and a pain like nothing she'd ever felt came rushing in, and the next few minutes and even hours were nothing more than a dream. Lee and Kenny managed to get the door of the locker open with the help of Clementine, but she couldn't remember how for sure. The St. John brothers and Brenda were all dealt with, and Lilly vaguely remembered taking one out herself when Lee refused to do it. A passing rainstorm left them all soaked as they left the farm in ruins, and a car of supplies they stumbled across on the way back to the motor inn became a horrible joke as she realized that coming across those supplies earlier might have kept them from going to the dairy in the first place. She knew taking the supplies would be wrong, and when Lee stood up and refused, she stood by him as everyone else raided what was likely the property of some other desperate soul. Hours turned into days, and Lilly shed tears over her father in private while focusing her attention in the group on long-term survival. Larry wouldn't be there to give her advice or help her lead the group anymore, but there were still people to protect and feed. Following the events at the farm, however, she noticed something odd with the counts that she'd been keeping with the supplies. As a preventative measure, she'd been keeping her own private count of food and medicine for a while, something she'd learned from her dad, and that count didn't match the count that the rest of the group knew about. The numbers were off, something that hadn't been an issue before, and it was specifically off for the painkillers. She knew that she wouldn't be able to investigate anything without Kenny causing a fuss, especially as he'd been an even bigger asshole than normal since killing her father. He'd been insisting that they needed to leave the motor inn, but she couldn't imagine trying to make things work anywhere else. They had an established routine at the motel, a way of doing things that felt comforting. Lee seemed to be on her side most of the time, though even he was starting to question staying, as supplies were low and Macon was nearly bare. She trusted his judgment more than she trusted Kenny's on the matter, but that still wasn't enough to convince her to jump in an old RV with Kenny and hit the road. Even so, the choice was ripped away from her as a group of bandits attacked just after Lee managed to confirm that someone had been truly stealing the supplies. He'd found a bag of medicine hidden just outside the makeshift wall, but before they could figure out who the culprit was, the bandits took several hostages, and they wound up having to shoot their way out of the motor inn and take to the open road in Kenny's RV. They'd barely gotten a few miles, however, when they had to stop as Kenny hit something, and Lilly decided that that would be the best time to figure out who had been stealing from them. She suspected Ben, the newest member of the group, as he'd been rather shifty since they'd returned from the farm. Carly was also a good suspect, though she was less likely to be a traitor, even if she was incredibly mouthy. As Kenny worked to free the zombie that they'd run over from the axle of the RV, Lilly worked to get a confession out of whoever had put the group in so much danger. The person was taking medicine that could be used to save one of their lives and giving it to the bandits that had just attacked them, and she was dead set on weeding them out and leaving them behind. But things didn't go as planned, as Ben refused to admit to the crime and Carly started making things personal. In Lily's mind, she'd lost so much and she felt that she had no control over anything in her life. Someone else had taken it upon themselves to kill her dad before she could even try to save him or say goodbye. Someone else had decided to steal from the group and given supplies away, hiding the evidence and lying in the official counts. Someone else had decided that she would need to leave the place that had been home ever since the world had fallen. She was helpless in a world that just kept getting worse, and she wanted desperately to take some of that control back by saving the group from the traitor. The gun was in her hand before she realized what she was doing, and pulling the trigger was way too easy. By the time she snapped back to reality, Carly was dead. Shock was the first thing to hit, but it was mixed with a million other emotions that would all soon be replaced by fear as Lee and Kinney banished her from the RV. She hadn't meant to kill the woman. At least she didn't think that she'd meant to do it. She just wouldn't shut up. As the RV pulled away, the weight of everything hit her like a ton of bricks. But she couldn't just give up as the dead closed in around her. Larry would be disappointed in her if she didn't fight to survive, even after she seemed to have lost anything worth fighting for. It would be a long time before she found another place that made her feel alive again. Groups, at least those willing and able to take on newcomers, were hard to find, and she didn't even know that she wanted to be a part of another one. She had the training to make it as long as she needed to on her own. But she wasn't prepared for the loneliness that came from being by herself. At first, she blamed Lee and Kinney for being so quick to push her out. But that feeling didn't last. In fact, she would come to see their decision as the right move. She had done something horrible, and she wasn't in her right mind. She was a risk to the group, and risks like that had to be dealt with. She spent years on her own, wandering lost in the world and never really belonging anywhere. She would occasionally run into other survivors, but she didn't want to get involved with anyone despite her longing for a place to call home. Eventually, though, she came upon a place called the Delta that needed her as much as she needed it. The community itself seemed to be thriving, but the resources and walls didn't come without a price, as they were at war with another community. The reasons for the war didn't really matter, as the opposing forces were a threat to the safety of all who called the Delta home. And for the first time in years, Lilly found something worth fighting for and protecting. But the people that lived there weren't enough on their own to protect the settlement, and they had taken to searching for recruits that could fight for them. Not all of the recruits were willing participants, however, but Lilly justified that in her mind by telling herself that the ends justify the means. If the Delta could win the war and survive, the price paid along the way would be justified. And most of the people they forced into service would have gladly done it willingly if they only knew what they were fighting for. She was sure of it. The easiest to conscript were children, as they were often willing to go along with just about anything and could be convinced much easier than adults. Over time, many of them were even thankful for the walls, food, and medicine the Delta had to offer. One day, she and a reconnaissance party she was leading came across a small group of 4 children that seemed to be on their own. She wanted to round them all up at first, but the oldest boy convinced her to only take the youngest of their group, a pair of twins that seemed to be a perfect fit for the Delta. She would agree to the trade, a pair of captives for the freedom of the others, but only temporarily. They weren't equipped to take on a bigger group, and she figured the kids had to be a part of some larger force that might be worth coming back for at a later time. And it was on the return trip, where they were looking for the rest of the group, when Lilly would get the shock of her life. One of the kids turned out to be the little girl that Lee had been protecting all those years ago, Clementine. She'd grown up a lot, and it turned out Lee had died protecting her. She'd apparently been raising a little boy for at least some time, and he was a real troublemaker from the get-go as he tried to attack Abel, one of Lilly's associates on the mission. After the brief encounter, Clementine and the boy escaped back into the woods, and Lilly returned to the riverboat that she and her group had been using as a base to plan their next move. The kids would definitely hold up somewhere in the woods, but it would take a couple of days before their location was known. Using her military training, Lilly was able to lead an incursion on the school the kids called home. But that backfired spectacularly, as the kids were ready for the attack, and were much more capable than she realized. She wound up having to kill one of them, though that was actually more of an accident as she was reacting to him running at her. Her original plan had been to talk the kids into coming peacefully, with taking them by force being the backup plan. Neither plan really went well though, and in the end they were barely able to get out of the school with 3 of the kids, losing a couple of their own people in the process. Things had gone seriously off the rails, and Lilly was starting to feel that old sensation of losing control of the situation. It had seemed so simple going in, but between Clementine being involved and the kids being a lot tougher than she expected, things were spiraling, and in the end, she decided to just cut their losses and run with the kids that they had actually managed to get. One of the kids reminded Lilly a little too much of Carly, as he wouldn't stop talking and didn't seem to understand the stakes. She couldn't kill him, as things had already gone so poorly, and they actually needed all the able bodies they could get. But she also couldn't continue to listen to him, and decided to make an example by removing his tongue. She wasn't proud of the decision, but it was better than shooting him. As she sat alone in the riverboat, her mind swirled with everything that had happened, and she felt herself slowly slipping away. She'd managed to leave her old life behind, choosing to bury everything that had happened with Lee, Kenny, and her dad. But Clementine coming back into her life brought it all flooding back, and she knew she couldn't let those old emotions cloud her judgment. Taking the children was strictly business, a way to protect the Delta. She had to do what needed to be done, just like Larry had taught her. But the kids couldn't leave well enough alone, sneaking onto the boat and attempting to free their friends. She thought that they might try something, and she'd been ready, managing to capture them all and lock them away. She wouldn't ever make it back to the Delta, however, as Clementine managed to escape her cell, and after a brief struggle on the deck, Lilly found herself staring down the barrel of a gun being pointed at her by Clem's protege, AJ. Part of her wanted him to pull the trigger, to end her life and let her finally be at peace. But Clementine wouldn't let him do it. The girl was weak, unwilling to do what was needed to survive, and she was teaching AJ to be the same way. And she would make them pay for their weakness by killing their friend as he moved to take the gun from AJ, using the knife that Clementine had jammed into her leg during the fight. She thought she'd regain the upper hand, but an explosion from below deck rocked the boat, and she was thrown clear of it before she could end either Clem or AJ. Scrambling out of the water, she managed to secure a raft and was fleeing the area as Clementine once more confronted her. She half expected the girl to fire an arrow at her, even kind of hoping deep down that she might, but that didn't happen. The conversation was brief, with Lilly trying to justify her actions, more for herself than to Clementine, and before long, she would find herself alone once more in the world with no home and no one around to comfort her. She couldn't go back to the Delta, they'd never allow her to come back after losing so much, and she didn't even know that she wanted to. Her ultimate fate is left up in the air. But that is the story of Lilly from Telltale Games' The Walking Dead. After all that, is she a friend or a foe? Lilly is often seen as one of the most hated characters in the game, but she's also the most misunderstood because it's a lot easier to hate her than to actually take the time to use empathy to understand her. She makes a lot of bad decisions, especially in Season 4. Though many of those decisions are about protecting the things that she cares about. When Clementine calls her evil as they're having that final conversation, Lilly responds to her by saying,
"Evil. It's not evil to fight for what you love."
She doesn't see herself as evil or doing anything wrong, and that's an important distinction to look at. Her actions follow the concept of the ends justify the means, as in doing things that might be harmful on the surface are sometimes necessary to protect the things that you see as important. Put another way, she might say that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, a concept we explored in our Season 4, Episode 3 breakdown. And let's look at her actions a little closer where the kids are concerned, because it isn't as black and white as many people seem to think here. For one thing, she took the twins and left Marlon and Brody unharmed in their first interaction. We don't know the details of the situation, only that Marlon traded the twins in order to get Lilly to leave the rest of the group alone, but all of that is hearsay. Marlon seemed to think that he had no other choice, but if the Delta was so in need of soldiers, why would Lilly not just take all 4 of the kids? She might not have had the forces to go after the school in the moment, but if she had 4 of them there in that moment, why not just take all 4 and come back for later for the rest? Why let 2 go and risk them telling the others? Then, when she shows up to the school, she spends a decent amount of time trying to convince them to come along rather than trying to get violent. It's assumed that she's lying about what the Delta has to offer, but why couldn't she be telling the truth? Obviously, we see things escalate and she winds up doing some pretty horrible things, namely cutting out Lewis's tongue, but before that, she seems more interested in having the kids come willingly, not kidnapping them. She and Abel do get rough with AJ and Clem, way rougher than they need to be, but that doesn't mean that the Delta is a horrible place. In fact, the only thing that we really have to go on, other than what they tell us, to figure out what is up with the Delta is the word of James. He might be a reliable source, but how do we know that we can trust him any more than we can trust Lilly? The whole situation is really just a mess, and without more details in game, we have to make a series of decisions that we can never really know for sure are right or wrong. And we have to stick with what we see in the game, disregarding the comics and developer interviews because in reality those things are unknown to the characters and any relevant details should have been included in the actual dialogue and general game. And that's just Season 4 Lilly, which makes this one of the most difficult friend or foe episodes. I would consider Season 1 Lilly a friend, generally speaking, especially before Larry's death, as she tends to have the best interests of the group in mind, and the only real complaint most people have about her is that she goes against Kenny, who just happens to be a fan favorite character. However, in this series, we have to take the whole picture into account and look at all of the characters' actions when determining if they would be someone that you might want to hang out with or avoid. And because of how atrocious some of the things that she did in Season 4 are, I have to label her as a foe. This makes her the second foe in the series, giving William Carver some company on the list. But I want to stress that she isn't evil, and she isn't even in the same camp as Carver on the foe side of things. Carver did a lot of really terrible things to serve his own ends and for selfish reasons, where Lilly is doing awful things in the service of the community that she sees herself as a part of. I think a DLC where we could play as Lilly in those interim years, discovering the Delta and learning the reason behind their desperation would be interesting because, as we'll be discussing in another video, you might be surprised at how far you'd be willing to go given the proper influence. Good people can be convinced to do some pretty awful things with the right push, and I think that applies to Lilly here. I noticed in the comments of the Season 4 Episode 3 video that a lot of people were really upset that I chose not to shoot Lilly. And while I can understand the desire to see her pay for what she'd done, I stand by that decision because retribution and revenge don't get us anywhere. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And while I think that she needs to atone for what she's done, I will never agree that having AJ shoot her was the best move. Not only is it immoral to shoot someone who's surrendering, no matter whether you believe they are actually doing so or not, but it's also a slippery slope. It's only a small step from, I did it because I didn't believe she was surrendering, in regards to Lilly, to justifying other acts of retribution in the group when someone makes you mad. Today, you're shooting Lilly. Tomorrow, you're pushing Reggie off the roof of Hal's Hardware. But what do you think? Is my assessment of Lilly fair? Is she a foe, or did I judge her too harshly? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. There are a ton of other characters I'm planning to cover in this series, and I'd love to hear who you want to see next in the comments as well. If a lot of people are asking to see the same character, I'll prioritize my time to make sure and get to them first. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the thumbs up down below, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any of the great videos I've got coming up. If you want to support the channel in other ways, while getting some pretty cool perks like your name on the screen, early access, and a lot more, I've got channel memberships and a Patreon where you can sign up to help me make bigger and better videos. That's all I've got for now. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
3 months. Your dad still treats me like I'm some kind of asshole.
Yeah, well, don't expect that to change. That's just how he is.
So, he's the asshole.
Look, my dad can be an ass sometimes, I know that. But he's not a bad guy. He's got a lot of pain. He's been through so much, and lost pretty much everything. And it's hardened him, you know? Yeah, he's bitter and hateful, but that's all just to protect himself. And me. All he's got left in the world is me. And that goes both ways. So yeah, he's probably gonna keep treating you like crap, but that's just because he still has one thing left to care about. So don't judge him. And don't judge me for sticking by him. He's my dad. And I love him.